Hi everyone, welcome to the live session of Appleby Academy. In today's live session, we are going to discuss 7 questions that were asked for NTA NET exam which was conducted on October 2020 as morning shift and also as afternoon shift. So in today's live session, we will be dealing with the 7 questions that were asked for NTA NET exam exclusively from the topic literary criticism. And before moving to the questions, I want you to know the importance of literary criticism and also the importance of time before the NTA NET exam. As we all know, NTA is conducting the upcoming exam from May 3rd to May 17th, and we are just 1 month apart from the exam. So most of you might be at your final stage of revision, and when you are doing your final stage of revision, or if you are doing your rough study before your exam, literary criticism is the most apt topic to be studied, because the first reason is that literary criticism is a must asked question for NTA NET exam, especially when NTA took over the exam. And the second important thing about literary criticism is that literary criticism has got very small portion of, or very less number of writers under them, and therefore it is something that can easily be covered. So as a strategical planning, it would always be perfect if you could go for the modules that can be easily covered, like literary theory, literary criticism, or the theories like or the modules like research methodology, language and pedagogy, English in India, because these are some of the modules that can be covered very fast. And if you're doing your 1 month study, then it will always be perfect to cover the areas like literary criticism. And towards the end of this session, I will also be giving an idea about who are the important writers that have to be studied or that have to be discussed while you are dealing with literary criticism. So in today's live session, as I said earlier, we are going to have a look on the important questions that were asked from literary criticism for the previous year. And why are we discussing this question today is because for the ones who are dealing or who are studying the topics that comes under literary criticism, it will be very useful for you to know, or it will be very useful if you could know what are the areas that ask for questions, or what are the areas or what are the dimensions in which you should look before you or while you are covering your portion. So that is why we are discussing the previous year questions, just to make you know the dimensions or the angles in which you should give your focus or you should pay attention, because this is a common misunderstanding or this is a common misconception that happens among the students. They often study things in a very broad way, but that is not the right perspective for cracking NTA NET exam. But you have to go very precisely. You have to remember the important facts related to these literary critics. So that is why we are discussing the previous year questions today. Okay, and in today's live session, we will be discussing about 7 questions that were asked for the previous NET exam. And when I say literary criticism or literary critics, these are the areas that we are supposed to cover. And I will also be giving you a detailed study or detailed we will go deep into the important writers of each and every period. But remember, literary criticism, it involves Greek critics, Roman critics, Enlightenment age critics, Romantic age critics, and Victorian age critics. So these are the important writers: Greek critics, Roman critics, Enlightenment age critics, Romantic age critics, and Victorian age critics. And we will be discussing about the important writers that belong to each of the groups. But remember, these are the areas that you have to cover. And now let us move to the first question. So the first question is a match the following, where you have to match list 1 with list 2. List 1 has Horace, John Dryden, Samuel Daniel, Ben Jonson. List 2, we have A Defense of Rhyme, timber or discoveries, ars poetics, and of dramatic poesy. So you have to remember that the writers like John Dryden or Ben Jonson or Horace, these are also the writers that wrote for fiction, but they are also the writers that had to be studied under literary criticism, especially John Dryden. Okay, because there is often a tendency among these students to look at the poetry collections or look at the plays written by such famous writers, leaving behind the prose works or leaving behind the critical works written by them. So remember, these writers, they might have written one or two works and they are very important from net point of view. So Horace, John Dryden, Samuel Daniel, Ben Jonson. And in list 2, we have a defense of rhyme, timber or discoveries, ars poetics of dramatic poesies. So what we can see if we look at the recent trends that can be found in Indian NET exam is that most questions that come from literary theory or literary criticism are basically from the very name and the author of that particular works. So remember, if you could study all the literary critical works and their respective authors, there is also a chance for you to answer more than 2 or 3 questions that come from literary criticism. So now let's go deep into this question. So we know about, first let us have a look on the important works written by Horace. So Horace, as we all know, is a literary critic. So these are the important works written by Horace: satires, epodes, odes, epistles, and ars poetics. So these are the important works written by Horace. And if you are studying for NTA NET exam, you have to look very precisely and also very deep into the topic Ars Poetica, because Ars Poetica is considered to be the magnum opus written by Horace or magnum opus of Horace, and therefore these are the works written by Horace: satires, epodes, odes, epistles, and Ars Poetics. So our first option is Horace and we have Ars Poetics. So you can link Horace with Ars Poetics. Now coming to the important works written by Dryden. Dryden has written these much critical works: essay on satire, essays on heroic tragedy, essays on heroic tragedy, and an essay on dramatic poesy. So these are the important works written by Dryden. So as we have just looked at the previous slide, John Dryden can be matched with an essay on dramatic poesy. So an essay on dramatic poesy is the most important work written by Dryden, and most of you might be familiar with this work, an essay on dramatic poesy, which is written as a conversation between 4 people, in which he makes clear, or he makes a debate between the French theatre, English theatre, and also between the ancient and the modern. So an essay on dramatic poesy, and we have covered this topic on John Dryden as a poet and also as a literary critic in our LMS platform. So please refer to that. So an essay on dramatic poesy is written by Dryden. So that is another our option. Then the next writer is Samuel Daniel. So you might also be familiar with Samuel Daniel. He was an English poet and a historian. So at first period of his life, he was a translator, and later he moved his career into original works writing, prose and verse, and he is known for his philosophic sense of history. And Samuel Daniel, he is known for his work A Defense of Rhyme, which was published in the year 1503. A Defense of Rhyme and Samuel Daniel, both of them are very important, because even for one exam, that is for 2020 exam, Samuel Daniel and his work were repeatedly asked as a question and also as an option. So that is also very important. And finally, we have Ben Jonson. So Ben Jonson, his work is Timber or Discoveries, which he published in the year 1640, where he attacked the contemporary stage practice. So if you have read our Elizabethan Jacobean age, then you might be familiar with Ben Jonson and his work Timber, in which he makes critical comments on the practices and also the philosophies followed by the contemporary stages or contemporary stage practices. So these are our 4 options, and these are their respective matchings. So now we have the option. So as we all know, the answer is option 3, that is A3, B4, C1 and D2. So let us once, so option 3, A3, B4, C1 and D2. Let's go back to the question. So we have Horace, who had written Ars Poetica. John Dryden can be matched with Of Dramatic Poesy. Samuel Daniel can be matched with A Defense of Rhyme. And Ben Jonson goes to Timber or Discovery. So that is the correct answer. So I hope it is clear. So let's go to the second question. So before going to the second question, I'm once again reminding you that we are doing this question, or you have to look at the previous year questions, because you will get an idea about how questions are asked from such a topic. As you all know, the syllabus of English literature is very vast, and therefore the pattern of studying should be confusing, and therefore you have to look at the previous year questions in order to get an idea about what to study and also how the questions are asked. So the second question: who among the following believe that rhyme is not an integral part of poetry? So here you have given 4 literary critics. So you have given 4 literary critics, and the question is, which among the literary critics does not support or does not feel that rhyme is an integral part of poetry? So the options are William Wordsworth, Horace, Samuel Daniel and Philip Sidney. William Wordsworth, Horace, Samuel Daniel and Philip Sidney, and the answer is Horace. So in the previous question, we have already mentioned that Horace had written Ars Poetica, in which he discusses about the important topics that a poet should cover, and about the poema, poetics, poesia, in which he divides Ars Poetica into 3. So these are some of the important things that you have to remember. So about Horace and his Ars Poetica, according to Horace, good poetry is a process of recreation, adaptation, and evaluation of something new from the old. So he never says that poetry is an imitation, or poetry is something, or a good poetry is an imitation of something that already exists. But according to him, it is a recreation. Poetry, a good poetry, of course, is a recreation, adaptation, and evolution of something that is considered to be old. And therefore, he never feels that rhyme is an integral part of a poetry. And these are some of the important concepts that he put forward in Ars Poetica. That is, a drama should not have more than 5 acts and not more than 3 characters in a scene. Rhyme is not an integral part of poetry. So these are some of the important points that he discusses, or some more important philosophies that he advocates in Ars Poetica. So as I said earlier, we have also covered Ars Poetica and Horace in detail. So I'm not going deep into it. So good poetry, it is a process of recreation, adaptation, and evolution of something new from old. And a drama should not have more than 5 acts. So this is another important point that you have to remember about Ars Poetica. And also, rhyme is not an integral part of poetry. Coming to the next question, arrange the following critical works in the chronological order of publication. So we have already discussed this question while we were dealing with the chronological order questions. So here, the question is exclusively from literary criticism, where you have to identify which literary critical work came first and which literary critical work came last. Okay, so while you are dealing with literary criticism and the literary critics and also their respective works, try to remember the works that produced the years that produced these works, because that is also very important. For example, the preface to Lyrical Ballads, which was published in the year 1800, that these are all some important dates that you have to remember if you are a literary student, and therefore you have to remember. And it is basically, it might be simple for the students, because these are some of the writers that you have already learned in British literature or American literature, and therefore it wouldn't be so hard for you to place them on the particular age. For example, we know William Wordsworth belongs to the Romantic age, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge belongs to the Romantic age, George Eliot belongs to the Victorian age. So you might be familiar with that. So, and apart from that, you should also remember the important years of these particular literary works. So here we are supposed to look at 4 important works: Preface to Lyrical Ballads, A Defense of Rhyme, Life of Cowley, and A Frontiers of Criticism. So these are the important works that we were dealing with: Preface to Lyrical Ballads, A Defense of Rhyme, Life of Cowley, and The Frontiers of Criticism. So moving deep into this question, so at first we have Preface to Lyrical Ballads. So Preface to Lyrical Ballads was published by William Wordsworth. We all know that lyrical ballads. So even in the previous video, while we were dealing with William Wordsworth as a poet and also as a literary critic, I have mentioned about lyrical ballads. So William Wordsworth, in collaboration with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, published lyrical ballads in 1798. And after that, they had got some clashes with them regarding the subject matter of poetry and also the way in which a poetry should appear. Then in 1800, William Wordsworth, he published lyrical ballads alone with a preface in which he made clear about his ideas of poetry, his ideas of what a good poet should be, and what are the subject matters of a good poetry. So Preface to Lyrical Ballads, and again in 1802 there was another volume or another edition of Lyrical Ballads. So Preface to Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth was published in the year 1800. Then we have A Defense of Rhyme. Okay, then we have A Defense of Rhyme. So in the first question, we already dealt with Samuel Daniel, the historian and the English poet. And about A Defense of Rhyme, it was published in the year 1503. So we have Preface to Lyrical Ballads, A Defense of Rhyme, and then we have Life of Cowley. Life of Cowley is the first chapter of Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets, which is also known as the Lives of Poets, which was published from 1779 to 81. 1779 to 81. Life of Cowley is the first chapter of Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets, or Lives of Poets, written by Samuel Johnson, in which he discusses about the biographies of different writers, including Abraham Cowley. Then we have the Frontiers of Criticism. So the Frontiers of Criticism, it is actually a lecture or a speech given by T.S. Eliot at the University of Minnesota in 1956. So we can say that the Frontiers of Criticism is the last work that falls into the chronological order among the options, and the first one will be A Defense of Rhyme by Samuel Daniel. So in order to order it, these are our options. Okay, so I'm not reading the options. So the correct answer, let's once again look at the options. So the correct answer, the correct order would be A Defense of Rhyme by Samuel Daniel. Then we have Life of Cowley, followed by Preface to Lyrical Ballads, and then by The Frontiers of Criticism. So that would be the correct answer. That is option number 3. Now coming to the next question, that is, poetry according to Philip Sidney is of 3 kinds. They are, okay, so here this question is about Philip Sidney. So Philip Sidney, he belongs to the middle-aged critics where he stands alone as a literary critic in the Elizabethan age. And this question is regarding the work written by Philip Sidney. So as we all know, Philip Sidney in his work has divided poetry into different, and this is where we have to identify the correct classification of poetry. So once again, remember, for literary criticism, you just don't have to look at the year of publication and also the author, but you have to go deep into the topics. For example, from the questions that were asked from Horace, we get to know that the questions can be asked from the important points that they discuss in their particular works. So we have poetry according to Philip Sidney is of 3 kinds. The options are religious, dramatic, romantic, classical, romantic, neoclassical, philosophical, imaginative, narrative, religious, philosophical, and imaginative. So these are the options: religious, dramatic, romantic, classical, romantic, neoclassical, philosophical, imaginative, narrative, religious, philosophical, and imaginative. So these are our options. And in his work, Sidney, in his work An Apology for Poetry, has divided poetry into three. And they are, the first one is religious poetry. So as we all know, what do you mean by religious poetry? Religious poetry or divine poetry, this is actually the poetry where we take God or we take spirituality as the important theme or as the recurring theme that occurs in that particular topic. So religious poetry is the poetry in praise of God. So remember, in defense of poetry, Philip Sidney has divided poetry into three. That is religious poetry, philosophical poetry, and true or imaginative poetry. So religious poetry is the poetry in which there is a praise of God, and philosophic poetry, it is the ideas of philosophy in which the abstract qualities like truth, love, or where we discuss about the virtue of certain qualities, where you have to think in order to understand what is discussed in that particular poem, where a quality or where an abstract quality is the main theme of or the recurring theme of that particular poetry. That is what we call as a philosophical poetry. And then we have the true or imaginative poetry, which is the perfect poetry according to Philip Sidney, because this is something that comes from the creative mind or the imaginative mind of a poet. So we have religious poetry, we have philosophic poetry, then we have true or imaginative poetry. And so these are our options. So here the correct option is option number 4, that is religious, philosophical, and imaginative poetry. Now the next question is, which two of the following plays are mentioned in T.S. Eliot's Tradition and Individual Talent? So this is the question. Which two of the following plays are mentioned in T.S. Eliot Tradition and Individual Talent? So the answer is Agamemnon. So the options are Agamemnon, Antigone, Othello, and Dr. Faustus. So these are the 4 options, and we have to identify the plays that are described or plays that are mentioned by T.S. Eliot in his essay Tradition and Individual Talent. So this is another reason why I wanted you to go deep into the literary text, because questions can be asked deep inside the text, because this question can only be answered if you had a great knowledge of this particular text, that is Tradition and Individual Talent, because this is actually an example taken by T.S. Eliot. So let us look at the essay. So Tradition and Individual Talent. The essay was first published in The Egoist and later in Eliot's first book of criticism, that is The Sacred Wood. Okay, so remember, that is the background details of Tradition and Individual Talent. I'm just coming to the question, because we have already discussed about them in our literary criticism. So the essay was first published in The Egoist, 1919, and later in Eliot's first book of criticism, that is The Sacred Wood, which was published in the year 1920. And you might be very familiar with this Tradition and Individual Talent, because this is actually a very common topic that is taken by all the universities for their post-graduation syllabus. So in Tradition and Individual Talent, T.S. Eliot, he formulates Eliot's influential conception of the relationship between the poet and the preceding literary traditions. So it formulates Eliot's influential conception of the relationship between the poet. So this basically speaks about the relationship between a poet and the literary tradition. So according to T.S. Eliot, when a new writer writes a new work, he gets into a literary circle that encompasses all the literary works that were produced from Homer till the contemporary time of that particular writer. So literature or literary work or the tradition is like a big circle that can easily accommodate any writer who comes in the next generation, because this basically speaks about the relationship that a writer has with his tradition. So tradition is a matter of much wider significance. So he basically speaks about the importance of knowing the tradition if you are a writer. And he also takes the example of the murder of Agamemnon or the agony of Othello from Antigone and Othello to describe the intensity of artistic process under which the fusion of creation happens. So this is our basic question. So what are the plays that were mentioned in T.S. Eliot's essay Tradition and Individual Talent? So the plays are Othello and Antigone, in which, and why is he basically speaking about these plays is because he wanted to show the agony of Othello and also the murder of Agamemnon from Antigone and Othello to describe the intensity of an artistic process, how much successful or how much excellence that you can find in a particular artistic process under which the fusion of creation happens. So these are the two plays that are mentioned. Okay, so our answer is Antigone and Othello. The next question is, who among the following refutes Plato's charge that poets are liars by arguing that the poet nothing affirms and therefore never lied? So before answering to this question, the question seems to be confusing, but this is actually a very perfect question or easily answerable question if you know the works of Dryden and Sidney or the Dryden and Sidney. Okay, for example, only the first thing you have to identify is that who supported or who voiced against Plato. Is it Dryden or is it Sidney? So we know that we have already discussed about Dryden. Dryden is not the answer because in Dryden's work, he basically speaks about a comparison between the ancient and modern, the French theatre and the English theatre. But that is not the case of Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney, in his apology for an apology for poetry, which he had written as a response to Stephen Gosen. So Stephen Gosen, a very Puritan, a stern Puritan believer who wrote about the demerits of poetry or the demerits of English literature, where he takes example or where he takes the points from Plato, because Plato was someone who abandoned or who banished poets from his ideal world, and therefore since everyone respects Plato, he too wanted English to follow such a tradition. But in this work, an apology for poetry, Sidney makes clear, or Sidney takes each and every point taken by Plato in order to defend poetry or in order to defend the use of literature. So the answer is Philip Sidney. So Plato, he sought to banish immoral and inferior poets of his time and not poetry itself. So that is the first defense given by Sidney in order to support poetry. That is, Plato sought to banish immoral and inferior poets. Plato never wanted to banish poetry of all time or as poetry itself, but he was fed up with the immorality or he was fed up with the inferior poets, and therefore he just wanted to banish them. And that was because he believed his mentor Socrates was arrested and Socrates was executed because of these poets. Then, according to him, a poet is a light-winged and sacred thing. A poet is not a mother of lies or a nurse of abuse, but at the same time, a poet should be considered as a light-winged and a sacred thing, because he is someone who speaks about the future. He is someone who attempts to make amends to what happens wrongly to the current world. So Plato is also. These are the different points in which through which Sidney defends poetry. So the answer is option 2, Philip Sidney. Coming to the final question, which of the following are Samuel Johnson's statements about metaphysical poets? Which of the following are Samuel Johnson's statements about metaphysical poets? They were singular in their thoughts. They were careful in their diction. They affected combination of dissimilar images, and they avoid occult resemblance. So we all know about metaphysical poets like John Donne Andrew Marvell, Abraham Coley. So these are the writers who got the name metaphysical poets during this Enlightenment age, especially from the works of Samuel Johnson, who regarded them as the poets who combined intellect and emotion. So the answer of this question is that, so you have to identify what are the important statements given by Samuel Johnson regarding the metaphysical poets. So according to Samuel Johnson, they were singular in their thoughts, because you cannot connect one metaphysical poet with another, because you cannot connect Andrew Marvell with Abraham Coley, because both of them wrote, though they took conceit, or they took these extended metaphors as a figure of speech or as a way of narration, still they stood alone. So metaphysical poets, they were singular in their thoughts. They could be combined together just because they belong to a particular age that took a particular way of writing, and they were careful in the diction. That is not the case, and they affected combination of dissimilar images. They avoid occult resemblances. So the term metaphysical poets, it was coined by the critic Samuel Johnson to describe a loose group of 17th century English poets whose work was characterized by the inventive use of conceits and by a greater, because we all have heard of this poem like A Valediction Forbidding Morning, in which he speaks about, or in which he compares love with combus. Okay, so such types of conceits can be seen in the works of the metaphysical poets, and by a greater emphasis on the spoken rather than the lyrical quality of their words. So these are some of the important characteristics of metaphysical poets as described by Samuel Johnson. So these are our options. B and C, C and D, B and A and C. So let's go back to the option. So our answer is option 4, that is A and C. They were singular in their thoughts, and they affected combination of dissimilar images. We know they were not careful in their diction, because they preferred to write in a spoken tone rather than in a written language, and therefore that is not the option. They avoid occult resemblances. That is also that's entirely contrast to the third one. So that's also not the answer. So the answer is option 1 and 3, that is A and C, and therefore the answer is option 4, A and C only. Okay, now, so these are the questions that were asked for the previous year, for the NTA NET exam, which was conducted on October. So remember, if you study thoroughly literary criticism as a module, then you can answer 7 questions. Okay, that itself gives you a great weightage, or that itself gives you a great chance for cracking NTA exam, and therefore focus more on the modules that can be covered easily, like literary criticism, literary theory, research methodology, language and pedagogy, English in India, where you can always expect few questions. I'm not saying that you shouldn't look at the bigger modules like British literature or drama, poetry, fiction. That's not what I'm saying, but try to give importance to these topics for this 1 month revision, not as an all, not if you are taking this for a very long time. That's not the case. But if you are planning to revise it for the final time, focus more on these modules. So now, as I promised, we will be I will be just giving you the names of the important writers that you have to study while you are dealing with literary criticism. So in our online LMS platform, I have covered all the topics regarding all the writers, Roman critics, Greek critics, all the writers. So the students of Appleby Academy, they can go back to the LMS account to have a look on all the writers, and remember the questions so that while you are studying it, try to learn it from that perspective, dimension and angle. So that would be really useful if you could do that. So as I said in the first slide, literary criticism or the literary critics, they can be classified into different groups according to the age in which they created their works. So we can divide them into Greek critics, Roman critics, and coming back to England, we have Middle Age critics, then we have Romantic critics, Victorian Age critic, Enlightenment Age critic, Romantic Age critics, and Victorian Age critics. And and we also take T.S. Eliot as a literary critic who comes into the Victorian Age or the early modern age. And why don't we have literary critics at modern age and postmodern age? It's not because there are no literary critics for that thing, but they mostly belong to the literary theory. So that's the difference. So for literary criticism, we have to cover Greek critics, Roman critics. Coming to London, we have this Middle Age critics, which begins with Philip Sidney. Then we have this Enlightenment Age critics, Romantic Age critics, Victorian Age critics. So these are some of the important writers that we have to look. And now coming to the Greek critics, these are the three Greek critics that you have to remember: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Try to get to know about the important works of Plato, like Republic. So Socrates, he had never published any work, but we get to know about the ideas of Socrates through the works published by Plato, because they basically are mentors for each other. Socrates, the student is Plato, and Plato has this student called Aristotle, and Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander the Great. So they are connected. And about Aristotle, try to focus more on poetics, the important thing, and try to know or focus more on the differences between epic and tragedy, and the definition of a tragedy, and also the different chapter divisions in which the work poetics is divided. So these are some of the important things that you have to cover under Greek critics. Now coming to the next chapter, that is Roman critics. In Roman critics, you have to look at the works of Horace, Longinus, and Quintilian. So at the beginning of this work, we have already discussed about Horace. So while you are dealing with Horace, try to give more focus on his work, Ars Poetica, how Ars Poetica is divided into, and what are the important points that he wants to advocate in Ars Poetica. So these are some of the important things that you have to look from Horace. And coming to Longinus, as we all know, he is the author of On the Sublime. So you have to look at what are the 5 qualities that makes a work true sublime. What are the qualities that belongs to the full sublime? So that these are some of the important things where you have to give more importance to grandeur of thought, diction. So these are some of the important things that you have to remember about Longinus. Quintilian is also important because his Institutia Oratoria is a very important work when it comes to rhetoric. Okay, so these are the 3 important writers: Horace, Longinus, and Quintilian. Horace, Longinus, and Quintilian. And coming back to England, that is in England literary criticism, we can begin it with Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney, he stands alone as a literary critic in the Middle Age. So Philip Sidney, we have already discussed about the work of Philip Sidney. So Sidney's An Apology for Poetry is a must learn work for NTA NET, because questions were repeatedly asked from Sidney's topic. You have to remember that An Apology for Poetry is written as a response to Stephen Gosen's School of Abuse. So you have to remember that thing, and you also have to remember the important points, how he defends poetry from Plato and Stephen Gosen, and what are the reply that he gives to Stephen Gosen when he calls poetry as the mother of abuse and the nurse of lies. So you have to remember each and every points, and how Philip Sidney divides poetry into 3. So these are some of the important points that you have to remember about Philip Sidney. Coming to the next writer, that is the Enlightenment Age critics. Enlightenment Age critics, we have John Dryden, Alexander Pope, and Samuel Johnson. So John Dryden, we discussed about the important works written by Dryden. So A Defense of Poesy is the most important work written by Dryden, in which he advocates the importance of English theatre and also the modern writers, and how he defends the modern theatre and also the English theatre from the attack of the French theatre and the ancient theater. So we have John Dryden. Then we have Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope and his criticism is also very important. Though this question was not asked for the last exam, this was Alexander Pope has got a very importance both in the case of poetry and also literary criticism. And when NTA has added this module called non-fiction, short stories and non-fiction, Alexander Pope should be given more weightage because he was someone who had got a great importance in non-fiction work, though his criticism were, and also his criticisms are very important because he wrote in verse. His criticism were in verse. For example, the works like An Essay on Man, An Essay on Criticism. So these are some of the important works written by Alexander Pope. Then we have Samuel Johnson. So you might be familiar with Samuel Johnson and his work, the preface to William Shakespeare, but that was not just a critical work written by Samuel Johnson. He had written biographies, including the lives of the famous poets, eminent poets, or the lives of poets, in which he takes the stories of Abraham Cowley, Byron, etc. So we have Samuel Johnson. Then coming to the Romantic Age critics, so we discussed about this William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the important critical works in our previous live session where we discussed about Wordsworth and Coleridge. So try to go back into that video and have a clear analysis on the critical works written by them. So William Wordsworth, he is known as a literary critic because of his work Preface to Lyrical Ballads, and we have Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is known for his work Biographia Literaria. And we have also, so while you're dealing with Wordsworth and Coleridge, try to look at the important points given by Wordsworth and also try to give more importance to the concepts developed by Coleridge, like fancy, primary imagination, secondary imagination, motiveless malignity. So these are some of the important concepts or terms developed by Coleridge that are also very important from a net point of view. And also we have John Keats with his two important literary critical concepts like negative capability and egoistical sublime. So try to give more focus, try to give importance, or try to cover the topics of Keats, because Keats is normally avoided. There is always a tendency among the students to avoid John Keats from this literary criticism, but John Keats and his negative capability is very important. Then we have this Victorian age critics where we have George Eliot, Friedrich Nietzsche, G.M. Hopkins, Henry James, Matthew Arnold, and T.S. Eliot. So these are some of the other critics that you have to remember who belongs to the Victorian age. So if we take George Eliot, she is known for her work Adam Bede, and for that work she had written a preface in which she introduces the aesthetic theory, and therefore that work is very important. And also about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is very important because of his concepts and in the way in which he influenced the upcoming writers, especially the modern and postmodern writers who believes in existentialism and other modernistic qualities. So Friedrich Nietzsche and his concepts are also very important. Then we have G.M. Hopkins. So we discussed about G.M. Hopkins in early Romantic age as a poet, but G.M. Hopkins is also very important from literary critical point of view because of his two important concepts. One is inscape and the other one is instress. So inscape and instress, try to look at the definitions of inscape and instress that are also very important. Then we have Henry James and we have Matthew Arnold and T.S. Eliot. So Matthew Arnold and his comments on culture and society, it's very important. And T.S. Eliot, so we have discussed about T.S. Eliot and his one work that is Tradition and Individual Talent, but he had written many other important works, and he also developed the term objective correlative. So these all belong to the critical areas of T.S. Eliot. So these are some of the important writers that you have to cover in Victorian age. So that's all. So in today's live session, in the first session, we discussed 7 questions that were asked for a single exam, that is October 2020. And then, and why we discussed that question was to make or get us familiar with the areas that the questions can be asked, and what are the areas that have to be covered while we are discussing literary, while we are learning literary criticism. And then I also gave you some important names of the writers and their important works that you have to cover while you are dealing with literary criticism. So that's all for today's live session. Thank you.